Before the storm there was silence. Not the silence of peace, but of a world holding its breath, a kingdom glittering with gold and shadow, where candles burned all night in mirrored halls, and hunger stirred in the fields beyond. It was the year 1788, and France was one of the grandest kingdoms in the world. Its capital, Paris, was alive with beauty and contradiction, palaces and prisons, philosophy and poverty, laughter and despair. At its heart stood a king, Louis XVI, a man of good intentions, mild manner and heavy uncertainty. He had inherited a throne wrapped in splendor and debt, a nation rich in culture but poor in coin, and a people who were beginning to murmur. Far from the noise of the city at Versailles, the royal court lived as if the world outside did not exist. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a universe of ritual and light, a golden stage upon which life itself was theatre. The fountains danced to music, the gardens stretched for miles, and each dawn was a ceremony. The king's waking, his meals, even his bedtime, all performed before courtiers who bowed and whispered as if in church. And beside him, radiant and controversial, stood Queen Marie Antoinette, daughter of the Austrian Empress, raised among silks and diplomacy, now the most admired and despised woman in France. She loved beauty, music, and laughter. She built a small village at Versailles where she played shepherdess among porcelain sheep, escaping the stiffness of court life. But outside the palace, her name had become a symbol of excess, of distance, of the cruelty of privilege. She never said the words, "Let them eat cake," but in the minds of the hungry she may as well have. For while Versailles glowed with candlelight, the countryside darkened with hunger. The winter of 1788 was bitter, the harvest poor. Bread, the staple of every home, grew scarce and costly. Peasants walked miles for loaves they could not afford. In Paris, bakeries were guarded by soldiers. Mothers waited in lines before dawn, their hands chapped and their eyes hollow, praying there would be flour enough when their turn came. And yet the taxes never ceased. The nobility and the clergy who owned vast lands paid little. The third estate, the commoners, paid nearly all. Farmers, artisans, merchants, lawyers, and laborers bore the weight of the realm. They carried the king's debts, the wars of the past, the extravagance of the present. The more they gave, the less they had, and still they were told it was their duty to serve. In taverns and workshops, in salons and city squares, talk began to turn from grumbling to questions. Why should a few live in eternal comfort while so many starved? Why should birth determine worth? The words of philosophers, once confined to books and salons, began to take root in the streets. Voltaire had mocked the arrogance of priests and kings. Rousseau had written that man was born free, yet everywhere he was in chains. Montesquieu had argued for the separation of powers, that liberty required law. These ideas spread like sparks on dry kindling. The Enlightenment, that great awakening of the human mind, had taught people not only to think, but to question. And once people begin to question, kings must tremble. But Louis did not tremble, not yet. He loved his people in the abstract, as a benevolent father might love unseen children, but he did not understand their world. He hunted, tinkered with locks, studied maps and clocks, and prayed earnestly for guidance. Yet decisions eluded him. His ministers warned him that the treasury was nearly empty, that the state could no longer pay its debts, that reforms were urgent. He dismissed one after another, afraid to anger the nobility, afraid to act too boldly. By 1788, even the royal advisers could no longer hide the truth. France was bankrupt. The wars of the past century, especially the costly support for the American Revolution, had drained the coffers. To raise new taxes required the consent of the realm, and for that, the king would need to call an assembly not seen in generations. The Estates General. It was a medieval institution, a gathering of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners. It had not been summoned in 175 years. Many thought it a relic, but desperate times make relics relevant. When the call went out, France stirred from slumber. Each village, town, and city elected representatives. Across the land, the people wrote their cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances, filling pages with hopes and anger. They wrote of hunger, of unfair taxes, of corruption, of privilege. But they also wrote of dreams, of a just king, of fair laws, of liberty and equality. Beneath their suffering, there was still faith that change might come, not through rebellion, but through reason. And yet, even as the preparations began, the world of Versailles continued its glittering routine. Courtiers danced, jewels sparkled, fountains played. The Queen hosted masked balls, unaware that masks were falling elsewhere. Paris buzzed with pamphlets, some mocking, some prophetic. Rumors swirled through the streets that nobles plotted famine, that the king would raise armies against his own people, that the country teetered on the edge of ruin. In coffeehouses, men in plain coats debated politics as fiercely as soldiers fought wars. Printers worked through the night, producing pamphlets filled with fiery words. The language of freedom, once whispered, was now shouted. One such voice belonged to a lawyer from Arras named Maximilien Robespierre. Quiet, precise, principled. He spoke of virtue and justice, of the rights of man. Others, like Danton and Mirabeau, thundered with passion. The revolution's leaders were not yet known as such, but their voices were already echoing through the heart of France. As spring approached, carriages rolled toward Versailles, carrying hundreds of delegates from every corner of the kingdom. Among them, nobles in lace and velvet, bishops in embroidered robes, and men of the Third Estate in modest black. They arrived with hope and tension, each knowing that the old order could no longer hold, but unsure what might replace it. In the fields, farmers paused from their ploughs to watch the dust rise from the king's roads, whispering prayers that something, anything might change. In Paris, the poor lined the bridges and quays, eyes hollow, waiting for bread. In Versailles, the mirrors of the great hall reflected not only light but illusion. The kingdom stood poised between two worlds, one gilded, one broken. The air seemed to shimmer with expectation. The people were still loyal, still patient, but patience, like bread, was running out. Soon the bells of Paris would toll not for ceremony, but for awakening. Soon the crowds would march, the Bastille would fall, and the language of kings would be replaced by the language of the people. But for now, for this last quiet night before the storm, France still slept beneath its golden ceiling. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the sound of the wind rising beyond the palace gates, carrying with it the first whispers of revolution. The storm that would one day shake thrones and topple kings did not begin with thunder. It began with words. Long before crowds filled the streets, before the guillotine gleamed beneath Parisian skies, the revolution was born in ink and paper, in salons and printing shops, in quiet studies where philosophers dreamed of reason, justice, and liberty. It was a revolution of the mind before it became a revolution of the sword. For more than a century, the Enlightenment had been growing across Europe like dawn, spreading over a dark horizon. France, brilliant and restless, became its brightest flame. Here thinkers challenged everything: superstition, tyranny, privilege, and the divine right of kings. Voltaire, sharp as lightning, struck at the arrogance of church and crown with wit that made readers laugh and tremble at once. Rousseau, tender and fierce, wrote that man was born free, yet everywhere in chains, words that would echo through the coming years like prophecy. Montesquieu argued that liberty depended on laws that balanced power, while Diderot gathered the knowledge of the age into his encyclopédie, declaring that reason, not tradition, should guide humankind. In Parisian salons, glittering gatherings hosted by noble women who delighted in the company of poets and philosophers, these ideas took flight. Beneath chandeliers and tapestries, the elite discussed equality, not realizing that their guests' words would one day turn against them. Books banned by censors were smuggled through ports, hidden beneath sacks of grain, passed from hand to hand in secret. The air itself seemed to hum with thought. And outside those salons, beyond the city walls, another kind of change was brewing. France was drowning in debt. Wars had bled the treasury dry, first the long struggles with Britain, and then the costly adventure across the Atlantic to aid the American Revolution. French soldiers returned from that distant war with strange ideas, that ordinary men could defeat kings, that liberty was not a fantasy, but a cause worth fighting for. They had seen a republic rise on the far side of the ocean, imperfect but alive, and they brought that vision home. Meanwhile, in the heart of France, Hunger gnawed at the people. The harvest of 1788 had failed. The winter was cruel, and the price of bread, the essence of survival, rose beyond reach. Families sold furniture, even clothes, for a loaf that might feed them one more day. In cities, the poor huddled in doorways. In villages, peasants boiled roots and grass. The word famine hung in the air like a ghost. And above them, the system of privilege stood untouched. Nobles still feasted while peasants starved. The church, owning nearly a tenth of all land in France, collected tithes from those who had nothing. Injustice was not hidden. It was ritual. In every courtroom, a noble's word outweighed a commoner's. In every tax roll, the poor bore the burden. But beneath that injustice, something was shifting. Something invisible, yet unstoppable. The Third Estate, those who worked, who built, who paid, began to discover their own voice. Lawyers, merchants, small landowners and artisans found courage in one another's words. Pamphlets spread like wildfire. One of them, written by a quiet clergyman named Abbé Sieyès, asked 3 questions that shook the kingdom to its core. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something. That little pamphlet was like a match dropped into dry grass. People saw themselves differently, not as subjects, but as citizens. The monarchy felt the tremors, but too late. Louis XVI, good-hearted but hesitant, wavered between reform and tradition. He appointed the reformist minister Jacques Necker, whose policies briefly eased the tension, then dismissed him under noble pressure, provoking outrage. Each act of indecision chipped away at faith in the crown. The nobles, fearful of losing privilege, resisted every call for fairness. The clergy stood divided, some with the people, others with power. And so, in early 1789, with the nation bankrupt and unrest spreading, the king did what had not been done for generations. He summoned the Estates General. For the first time in 175 years, representatives from all 3 estates, clergy, nobility and commoners, would gather to advise the king on the fate of France. Across the land, elections were held. Every village and town, no matter how small, sent its voice. The people wrote their cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances, pouring out their hopes, demands and despair. The pages filled with the same words repeated endlessly: bread, taxes, justice. They asked for equal laws, fair courts, and relief from hunger. Some still spoke reverently of the king, believing he would hear their cries. Others, quietly, began to dream of something new. A France that belonged not to kings and nobles, but to everyone. In the spring of that year, Paris pulsed with anticipation. The streets overflowed with pamphlets, rumors and songs. Writers became heroes. Printers became revolutionaries, and every café hummed with debate. The people no longer waited to be told what to think. They had begun to think for themselves. And yet, amid this awakening, the old world still glittered. At Versailles, balls continued, carriages rolled through the palace gates, and courtiers gossiped about fashions, not famine. The Queen's dresses shimmered like clouds of silk, even as her name was cursed in the streets. Few at court understood how close the ground beneath them was to breaking. When May came and the Estates General opened in Versailles, it seemed at first like a grand ceremony. The clergy arrived in flowing robes, the nobles in silk and jewels, the commoners, the Third Estate, in simple black. As they filed into the vast hall, tension hung like smoke. They bowed to the king, but their thoughts were elsewhere. From the start, it was clear that unity was an illusion. Each estate voted separately, and the first 2, in clergy and nobility, outnumbered the Third Estate 2-1. Every proposal for reform was crushed before it could breathe. The people's representatives realized they were being used, not heard. And then, something extraordinary happened. On a warm June day, the members of the Third Estate broke from custom. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true voice of the French people, and swore not to disband until a new constitution had been written. Locked out of their usual meeting hall by royal guards, they gathered instead in an indoor tennis court. There, under the high wooden roof, they raised their hands as one, taking what became known as the tennis court oath. It was an act of defiance unlike any France had seen in centuries, and though it began with words, those words carried the weight of history. Outside, the people waited, hungry, restless, watching. Something was changing, though few yet understood how much. The ideas that had begun as whispers in books and salons were now alive in the hearts of men and women who had nothing left to lose. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was charged with its coming. The harvests were still poor, the bread still scarce, and soldiers still guarded bakeries. But now, when they looked toward Versailles, the people no longer saw gods. They saw men, and men could fall. In that tension between old and new, between hunger and hope, between silence and speech, the revolution's roots dug deep. The soil was ready. The seeds had been planted. All that remained was rain and thunder. The summer of 1789 arrived with the promise of light, and yet the air was heavy, not with warmth but with waiting. From every corner of France they had come, priests in humble robes, nobles in powdered wigs, merchants, lawyers, and farmers. The voices of a nation gathered for the first time in living memory. Their destination, the Palace of Versailles, that radiant symbol of royal majesty, where marble gleamed and fountains whispered of a France that once believed in eternity. It had been 175 years since a king had summoned the Estates General. The idea itself seemed ancient, almost sacred, the embodiment of France's three orders. The first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, the commoners, the vast majority of the nation. When they entered Versailles in May 1789, the divisions were as visible as their clothes. The clergy wore white and gold, the nobles glittered in crimson and lace, and the delegates of the third estate came draped in plain black. Yet beneath those somber garments their hearts burned with a quiet fire. They knew they represented more than themselves. They represented the millions who toiled and hungered, who had no voice but theirs. At first, there was ceremony, long, ornate, and heavy with ritual. The king sat upon his throne, serene and distant, surrounded by courtiers, as the archbishop blessed the gathering. But beneath the gilded ceilings, tension shimmered. Each estate had only one vote, meaning the privileged orders could always outvote the commoners. The system was not a dialogue, it was a cage. In the corridors, whispers spread like smoke. The third estate demanded that votes be counted by head, not by order, that every representative's voice be equal. The nobles refused. The clergy hesitated, divided between old loyalties and new sympathies, and the king, uncertain, stalled for time. Days turned to weeks. Outside the palace, the air of Versailles grew stifling. Inside the hall, patience thinned. The people of the third estate were no longer merely delegates. They were men awakening to power. Among them was a small, stern lawyer from Arras, Maximilien Robespierre, who spoke softly but with conviction about the rights of man and the duty of justice. There was the thunderous Mirabeau, a noble by birth but a rebel by heart, whose booming voice could silence an entire room. And there were hundreds of others, ordinary men who had never before seen the inside of a palace, now standing beneath chandeliers, demanding to be heard. When compromise failed, when the king continued to delay, the Third Estate made a decision that would forever change history. On June 17, 1789, in a vote of 491 to 89, they declared themselves not a mere estate, but the National Assembly, the true representatives of the people of France. In that moment, the revolution stepped from thought into action. The declaration spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered in the streets of Paris to cheer. Newspapers printed the news in bold letters. The old order, that fragile scaffolding of divine right and privilege, trembled. But the palace did not move. 3 days later, when the delegates of the assembly arrived at their meeting hall, they found the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. The king's ministers claimed it was due to preparations for a royal session. But the message was clear. They were being silenced, and yet silence was no longer possible. In the heat of June, the deputies walked through the streets until they found an open building, large enough to hold them all, the Royal Indoor Tennis Court. Beneath its arched ceiling, the air thick with sweat and defiance, they stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wore robes, others rough wool. Their hands trembled, their hearts pounded. Then one by one they raised their right hands. The sound of voices filled the hall like a prayer and a thunderclap combined. They swore an oath, the tennis court oath, never to separate, never to surrender, until France had a constitution. The nation, they declared, will not be silenced. It was more than defiance. It was a promise that the authority of the people stood higher than the authority of kings. When word reached Louis XVI, he was bewildered. He did not yet see this as rebellion, only as impudence. He planned a royal session to reassert his authority, hoping to calm the storm. But calm was no longer possible. The king's guards watched the growing crowds uneasily. In the city of Paris, rumors bloomed faster than truth. Bread prices rose again, and unrest spread through the narrow streets. At night, people gathered by candlelight, reading aloud the latest pamphlets, words that spoke of liberty, equality, and rights that could not be taken by decree. Meanwhile, in Versailles, the struggle reached its next turning point. On June 23rd, the king held his long-awaited royal session. Surrounded by nobles and soldiers, he declared that the Estates General would continue as before, each order voting separately. He demanded obedience. When he finished, he left the hall, his robes trailing behind him, expecting the deputies to disperse. But they did not move. The royal guards hesitated, uncertain whether to act. The assembly sat in silence, then Mirabeau rose. His voice thundered through the chamber. "Go tell your master that we are here by the will of the people, and that we will not leave except at the point of a bayonet." That single sentence, bold, dangerous, unthinkable, shattered centuries of submission. For the first time in living memory, a subject had defied the king's command and lived to tell it. The next day, priests from the clergy crossed over to join the National Assembly. Soon after, some nobles followed. The tide had turned. The king, realizing he could not undo what had begun, reluctantly ordered the remaining estates to join as one body. And so, beneath the chandeliers of Versailles, the three estates merged, not in harmony but in necessity. The National Assembly now stood as the legitimate voice of France. Outside the palace gates, a crowd had gathered, chanting, waving banners, celebrating. Some wept, others knelt, as if before an altar. They had witnessed the birth of something new, a nation claiming itself. But with birth comes pain. The unity was fragile, the hunger still unrelieved, and the city restless. In Paris, the tension coiled tighter with each passing day. Soldiers filled the streets, and rumors whispered that the king was bringing foreign troops to crush the assembly. Fear and hope mingled like storm clouds and lightning. On the night air, voices carried the sound of songs, of speeches, of the people awakening. The wind that rustled through the fields and alleys of France seemed to whisper the same phrase again and again. The people are rising. The court at Versailles still shone with gold and laughter, but its days of unchallenged rule were fading like candlelight at dawn. For outside the palace walls, history was already moving. The murmurs had become a roar, and soon that roar would echo from the heart of Paris, not in words, but in action. The air in Paris was thick, not just with heat, but with hunger, fear, and a trembling kind of hope. Bread was scarce, prices soared, and the city that had long murmured about injustice now began to shout. The National Assembly had declared itself the voice of the people, but far from Versailles, in the narrow streets of Paris, those people waited for proof that their voices truly mattered. The king's hesitation had turned to silence, and silence is the mother of rumor. In taverns and marketplaces, the whispers grew darker by the hour, that Louis XVI was gathering troops, that cannons were being moved toward the capital, that the National Assembly would soon be dissolved by force. And in every whisper there was one name, Jacques Necker. Necker, the Swiss-born finance minister, was the only man in government widely loved by the people. He spoke of reform, reason, and justice, rare words in the corridors of power. When on the 12th of July news broke that Necker had been dismissed and replaced by royal hardliners, Paris erupted. The dismissal felt like betrayal. It was proof, people believed, that the king had chosen force over dialogue, the sword over the pen. Crowds filled the streets, swelling by the hour. The gardens of the Palais Royal became their heart, a pulsing sea of anger and passion. There a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins leapt upon a table, his voice trembling with fire. "They mean to slaughter us," he cried. "To arms, citizens!" His words fell like sparks onto dry kindling. People tore leaves from the chestnut trees and pinned them to their hats as symbols of revolt. The crowd surged through the streets shouting for liberty. That night the city boiled. Soldiers of the French Guard supposed to keep order refused to fire upon the people. Many deserted their posts, joining the mob instead. By dawn, Paris was no longer merely restless. It was armed. The great armory at Les Invalides was stormed, its gates smashed, its stores of muskets and powder seized by the people. But one thing was missing: gunpowder. Without it, their new weapons were little more than metal clubs. And so thousands of Parisians turned their eyes toward a fortress that had long cast its shadow over the city, the Bastille. For centuries, the Bastille had stood as a grim symbol of royal power. Its high stone walls and iron gates had held not armies, but words pamphleteers, critics, thinkers who dared question the crown. To the people, it was not merely a prison, it was tyranny itself made stone. Now they would bring it down. Morning broke hot and heavy. On July 14th, the crowd gathered before the Bastille, an immense shifting sea of humanity. Artisans, merchants, soldiers, beggars, even children. Some carried muskets, others held axes, knives, or farming tools. Overhead, banners of makeshift liberty fluttered in the smoky air. Inside, the Bastille's governor, Bernard-René de Launay, looked down from the ramparts. He commanded a small garrison, barely 100 men, but had orders to defend the fortress. He could see the mob swelling in the streets, could hear their shouts. They demanded the surrender of the fortress and its stores of gunpowder. De Launay hesitated. He knew resistance was hopeless, yet surrender felt unthinkable. For hours, negotiators moved between the crowd and the gates, voices rising, tempers flaring. Then a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. And the world tilted. Gunfire erupted. Smoke rolled over the square. The mob surged forward like a wave crashing against stone. Cannons were dragged from the streets and turned upon the gates. The air was a storm of noise. Muskets cracking, bells clanging. The roar of thousands crying out as one. From the city rooftops, smoke curled into the July sky, black and thick as ink. Inside the fortress, chaos reigned. De Launay ordered his men to cease fire, then to resume. The defenders fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. By mid-afternoon, the crowd broke through the outer defenses. They poured into the courtyard like a flood. When the gates finally gave way, the people of Paris surged inside, their fury unstoppable. De Launay, realizing it was over, demanded safe conduct for his men. He was captured instead, dragged through the streets, beaten and killed by the same citizens he had once ruled over. By evening, the fortress that had stood for centuries was in the hands of the people. Its prisoners, only 7 in total, were freed. Among them was an old noble accused of madness, 2 forgers, and 4 petty criminals. It did not matter. Their freedom symbolized the freedom of all. As the sun set over Paris, the tricolour, blue, white and red, began to rise. That night bells rang from every steeple. Fires burned in celebration. The Bastille, once a symbol of fear, now became the symbol of revolution. Its keys were sent to George Washington in America as a token of liberty's triumph. In the royal palace at Versailles, the news arrived at midnight. The king, half asleep, was awakened by the Duke of La Rochefoucauld. "Is it a revolt?" Louis asked. The Duke hesitated. "No, sire," he replied softly. "It is a revolution." Louis stared into the candlelight, silent. Somewhere deep within, he must have felt the ground shifting beneath him, but the truth was still distant, softened by marble walls and courtiers' whispers. He ordered the troops to withdraw from Paris, but the city had already declared itself free. Within days, the revolution had a symbol, a song, and a heartbeat. A new militia, the National Guard, was formed, commanded by the hero of 2 worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought for liberty in America and now returned to guard it in France. He adopted a new flag, the tricolour, combining the red and blue of Paris with the white of the monarchy, a promise of unity. In the streets, people embraced one another as brothers. Hope filled the air like incense after storm. For the first time, it seemed, France belonged not to a crown, but to its people. But freedom, like fire, cannot burn without danger. The victory was intoxicating, and intoxication can turn to fever. The same passion that tore down the Bastille could just as easily devour those who lit it. In the months ahead, bread would remain scarce, suspicion would grow, and power, that elusive ancient flame, would begin to shift in unpredictable ways. For now, though, Paris celebrated. Lanterns glowed above the Seine. The night sky was filled with laughter and song, and in that shimmering light, for one brief, fragile moment, it felt as if the world had been reborn. The Bastille had fallen, and with it the first stone of the old world. But revolutions do not end with a single victory. They spread like wind across dry grass, invisible yet unstoppable. And as the smoke cleared over Paris, that wind began to move through the valleys and fields of France, whispering strange and powerful things. It was the summer of 1789. The wheat ripened beneath a golden sun, but in the hearts of the people, the warmth of hope mixed with the chill of terror. For in every village, in every market square, rumors flew faster than truth. They said that armies of nobles were gathering to crush the revolution, that foreign mercenaries were marching toward the towns, that brigands paid by the aristocracy were burning crops, slaughtering peasants, spreading famine. The stories changed with every telling, but they always ended the same way. They are coming for us. The panic that swept across France in those weeks became known as La Grande Peur, the Great Fear. In the northern plains, farmers abandoned their plows and took up scythes as weapons. In the south, church bells rang through the night, summoning villagers to defend themselves. In the west, peasants hid their grain, their children, their few treasures, certain that soldiers would arrive at any moment. There were no armies, no mercenaries, only the echo of fear, yet that echo was enough to shake the kingdom. When fear takes root in the hearts of the poor, it does not stay still. It turns into something else, anger. And so the peasants turned their eyes toward the great manors that dotted the countryside, the stone symbols of centuries of oppression. They had tilled the nobles' fields, paid the nobles' taxes, and bowed before the nobles' gates. But now, with Paris in revolt and the king silent, they felt something new. Permission. Across the provinces, fires rose against the night. Peasants stormed chateaux, seized grain, burned records, those cursed parchments that listed the rents, the debts, the duties owed to lords long dead. In some places they demanded the nobles' oath to liberty. In others they drove them out entirely. It was not simple vengeance. It was an uncoordinated, unplanned revolution of its own, wild, desperate, and strangely pure. In Paris, word of the uprising reached the National Assembly like a storm warning. Deputies debated day and night, their voices echoing through the halls of Versailles. Some were horrified by the violence, others understood it too well. "They are destroying the old order," one said quietly. "The question is, will we help them, or will we try to stop them?" The assembly was trapped between ideals and fear. To condemn the peasants outright was to betray the very revolution that had begun in their name. But to do nothing was to risk chaos, anarchy, the collapse of all law. And yet it was in that tension, between reason and desperation, that France would take one of its most extraordinary steps forward. On the night of August 4th, 1789, the deputies of the National Assembly gathered beneath the chandeliers of the Great Hall. Outside the air was thick and still, but inside history crackled like fire. It began quietly. A nobleman, the Viscount de Noailles, rose and offered to renounce his feudal privileges. His voice shook, but his words caught like flame. Others followed. The Duke of Aiguillon, another aristocrat, declared that privilege was an injustice to be abolished. Then a bishop stood, offering to give up the church's feudal rights. One by one, the members of the assembly, nobles, priests, and commoners alike, began to rise. What began as speeches became a chorus. Some offered their titles, others their hunting rights, others the taxes their ancestors had demanded for generations. For hours, the hall echoed with declarations of sacrifice. Tears glistened on faces. Applause thundered through the chamber. It was as if the entire weight of the Middle Ages, centuries of hierarchy and submission, was melting before their eyes. By dawn, they had voted to abolish feudalism in France. No more tithes to the church, no more dues to lords, no more manorial courts. The peasants of France were at last free. In the villages, the news spread slowly. A rumor at first, then a truth, then a miracle. For centuries, the peasant's life had been chained to obligation. Corvée labor, payments in grain, endless taxes to nobles who might never visit their lands. Now, all that was gone. The documents that once recorded those debts, the terriers, were brought into public squares and burned, their ashes rising like black snow against the dawn. The old world had not vanished overnight, but for the first time, the people believed it could. And yet even freedom has its price. In the cities, grain still ran short. In the countryside, violence flared and flickered, sometimes against nobles, sometimes between neighbors. The revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, were still only words, fragile and untested. But now those words were written not just in pamphlets or speeches, they were written in the hearts of millions. Meanwhile, in Paris, a new document was being born. The National Assembly, inspired by the events of August 4th, began drafting something greater than law, a declaration of belief. It was to be called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It would say simply and profoundly that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. That sovereignty belongs to the people. That liberty means doing anything that does not harm another. Those sentences would echo far beyond France, through centuries across oceans. But for now, in the summer of 1789, they were the soft murmur of a dream taking form. In the villages, peasants looked at their fields and saw them differently, no longer as the land of a lord, but as their own. In Paris, the streets that had once trembled with fear now buzzed with a strange, uneasy pride. The king, far away in Versailles, hesitated still. He had agreed to little and understood even less. But the world he ruled was already vanishing. His power, once divine, was now debated in pamphlets. His subjects, once silent, now spoke with conviction. The great fear had begun as panic, but it had ended as transformation. The revolution had given the people not just courage, but consciousness. They had seen what could happen when fear was replaced by action, when centuries of obedience cracked and something brighter shone through. And as the August sun rose over a France forever changed, it illuminated a truth no king could undo, that once a people have seen their own power, they cannot unsee it. In the late summer of 1789, the air over Paris shimmered with a strange mix of exhaustion and expectation. The smoke from the Bastille had faded, but something far greater was being forged, not in iron or fire, but in words. The people had stormed their prison. The peasants had burned their chains. Now the revolution sought to define itself, to give its beating heart a name, a voice, and a soul. Inside the halls of Versailles, the National Assembly met beneath painted ceilings and heavy chandeliers. The air was thick with sweat and ink, parchment and passion. Deputies argued, wrote, tore up drafts, and began again. For they were not merely making laws, they were writing a new world into being. In that hall, voices rose and fell like the tides. Some spoke as philosophers, others as politicians, and others still as dreamers. They were men of different regions, faiths and tempers, but they shared one belief, that France could no longer belong to a king, but to its people. They spoke of liberty, of equality, of rights that no crown, no church, no sword could take away. From these ideas came something extraordinary, a document that would not only define the revolution, but reshape humanity's understanding of itself, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It began simply, almost humbly. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. 11 words, but those words struck like lightning across the darkened sky of history. Never before had such a claim been written not as philosophy, but as law. It denied the divine right of kings, the hierarchies of birth, the ancient chains of feudalism. It declared that sovereignty, the power to rule, rested not in monarchs or priests, but in the nation itself. For the first time, the people were not subjects, they were citizens. Article by article, the declaration unfolded like a prayer and a promise. Liberty consists in doing anything that does not harm another. Law is the expression of the general will. Every man is innocent until proven guilty. No one shall be disturbed for their opinions, even religious ones. To modern ears, they may sound familiar. But in that moment, in a Europe still ruled by emperors and popes, they were revolutionary fire. The words were shaped by the Enlightenment, but also by experience. France had seen injustice too closely to write vaguely about it. Every article was born of pain, of hunger, of censorship, of imprisonment without trial. At night, by candlelight, the deputies worked, papers piled high, pens scratched across parchment. Sometimes they argued until dawn, voices hoarse, eyes hollow. They debated not only what freedom was, but what it should mean. The Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, played a leading hand in its drafting. Fresh from his campaigns in America, he had fought beside Washington and carried home the idea of a constitution born of the people's will. Now, he saw the chance to give France her own declaration of independence, not from a foreign king but from her own past. At his side was the philosopher Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the same clergyman who had asked months before, "What is the third estate?" His answer now guided the pen of history. Even Thomas Jefferson, then the American ambassador in Paris, offered advice and inspiration. Across the Atlantic, the ink of the American Declaration of Independence had barely dried, and now France sought to add her own chapter to the story of human freedom. And yet, these men knew the weight of what they were doing. To declare that all men were free and equal was to set the world ablaze. For if that were true, then monarchy, privilege, and inherited power were crimes against nature itself. Each article struck a blow not against a man, but against an entire system. Outside the palace walls, Paris held its breath. The people had heard rumors that a new law was coming, one that would make all men equal. In the markets and the cafes, they argued over what that could mean. Would bread be cheaper? Would taxes vanish? Would the nobles bow as commoners did? The reality was both simpler and grander. The declaration did not promise comfort, it promised dignity. When at last, on the 26th of August 1789, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the moment passed almost quietly. No fireworks, no marching drums, just applause, slow, hesitant at first, then rising into thunder. Outside, news spread like dawn. Bells rang from steeples, pamphlets flew through the streets, and people gathered at crossroads to hear the articles read aloud. In villages, peasants knelt as the words were spoken, tears streaking their faces. In the cities, workers raised their fists. For centuries, the law had been a weapon of the powerful. Now, for the first time, it was a shield for everyone. Even the church, ancient guardian of the soul, could not claim such authority. The declaration was secular, grounded not in heaven but in reason. It placed faith in humanity itself. But for all its beauty, the declaration was also fragile. It spoke of men, not women, not slaves, not the poor who still starved, while others debated ideals in marble halls. Its vision was vast, but imperfect. And yet, even in its limits, it opened the door to every future fight for justice. In the quiet after its passage, some deputies sat alone at their desks, staring at the parchment. Perhaps they understood what they had done. Perhaps they feared it. Because words like these cannot be undone. Once declared, they live in the air, in the minds of all who hear them, and those words would echo beyond the Assembly, beyond France, beyond the century itself. They would inspire revolutions in Europe, uprisings in Latin America, protests in every land where freedom was only a dream. The words would one day be spoken by the oppressed, the enslaved, the silenced, and each time they were spoken, they would carry the same quiet thunder. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and remain free. But in 1789, that thunder was still distant. For while the Declaration shone with idealism, the streets of Paris still groaned with hunger. Bread was dearer than ever, and rumor was hungrier still. The king had yet to approve the document, and his hesitation, that endless hesitation, deepened the rift between crown and people. In Versailles, Marie Antoinette watched the crowds from her window, the gardens below blooming with summer roses. Perhaps she wondered how the laughter of her youth had turned to cries of hatred. Louis XVI, meanwhile, sat at his desk, the declaration before him. He hesitated, as always. He believed himself still the father of his people, but he no longer understood them. To sign was to surrender. To refuse was to invite chaos. Outside the palace, the world waited. And as the heat of August gave way to the chill of autumn, France stood at the edge of transformation once more, torn between hope and hunger, ideal and survival. The revolution had found its voice. Now it would have to find its body. The autumn of 1789 came heavy with rain and rumour. The harvest was poor, the stores were thin, and the price of bread, that simple sacred loaf, rose higher than ever. In the narrow streets of Paris, where chimneys smoked over broken roofs and children cried from hunger, the promise of the revolution began to sour. Freedom had been declared, rights had been written, but freedom could not be eaten. Rights could not fill an empty stomach. Each morning the same question echoed through the markets and alleyways. Where is the bread? The bakers had none. The grain merchants shrugged. The royal granaries, they said, were full, but only for the palace, not the people. And so hunger turned to anger. By early October, a whisper was moving through the city, that at Versailles, the royal court had held a banquet for the king's guards. The story, half true, half myth, said that nobles had trampled the tricolour cockade beneath their boots, mocking the revolution, as they drank wine beneath golden chandeliers. It was the spark that found the powder. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, rain lashed against the rooftops. Women gathered at the markets. Vendors, mothers, washerwomen, their baskets empty, their patience gone. One shouted, then another, until the square was filled with voices. "Bread," they cried. "We want bread." At first it was a protest. Then it became a movement. The crowd swelled as women marched through the streets, banging pots and drums, drawing others from their homes. Some carried sticks, others knives, a few muskets. Most carried nothing but fury. A young woman with wild eyes shouted that they would go to Versailles themselves, to the king, to demand bread. Others took up the cry, "To Versailles, to the king." The march began like a storm gathering strength. Through the mud and the rain, thousands of women trudged toward the distant palace, 15 miles away. Their skirts soaked, their shoes ruined, their hearts burning. Along the way, men joined them, workers, soldiers of the National Guard, and curious onlookers who could not resist the gravity of what was happening. By the time they reached the city gates, the crowd numbered in the tens of thousands. Inside Versailles, the king was hunting. The queen played with her children. The court, as ever, moved at its own slow rhythm, unaware that history itself was marching toward their doors. When the first of the crowd appeared on the road, mud-smeared and shouting, the guards stared in disbelief. These were not soldiers, but women. Ordinary women, soaked and exhausted, their faces lined with hunger and fury. They demanded to see the king. They demanded bread. The palace gates were closed, but the mob filled the courtyards, roaring like a sea against the marble steps. Deputies from the National Assembly came out to meet them, trying to calm the tide. Among them was the Marquis de Lafayette, commander of the National Guard, the hero of two worlds suddenly caught between king and people. He rode ahead, promising that he would go to Versailles himself, that no harm would come to the royal family. But the women would not wait. They stormed the assembly hall, dripping rain onto the marble floor, shouting for justice. Some carried pikes, others carried loaves of bread impaled upon them, mocking the feast they imagined at the palace. "Tell the king," one woman cried, "that we are hungry, and that if we must we will eat the bread of his flesh." The deputies, pale and trembling, promised to deliver their demands. The crowd refused to leave. As night fell, Lafayette and the National Guard arrived at Versailles, 20,000 men, their tricolour cockades glinting in the torchlight. The tension hung thick as fog. Louis XVI met Lafayette at last. The general bowed low, asking the king to speak to the crowd, to promise bread and peace. The king, cautious and weary, agreed. He stepped out onto the balcony, rain dripping from the eaves, and promised that the grain would be sent to Paris. The people cheered. For a moment it seemed the night would end in calm. But revolutions do not rest easily. As dawn approached, a cry split the silence. The gates had been breached. A mob of men and women poured into the palace, sweeping past the guards. Shots rang out. The marble halls that had echoed with music and laughter for centuries now echoed with chaos. They stormed the Queen's apartments, breaking through the doors as Marie Antoinette fled barefoot through a secret passage, clutching her children's hands. Guards were slain. The walls that had seen endless ceremony now saw blood. In the courtyards below, Lafayette tried desperately to restore order. He pleaded with the Queen to appear before the people. At first she refused, but when dawn broke and the sky began to pale, she stepped out onto the balcony. Her hair was disheveled, her gown stained from flight. She stood alone, pale against the light, facing thousands of voices crying for her death. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then Lafayette stepped forward and bowed to her. It was a gesture of respect, or perhaps surrender. The crowd, seeing it, began to cheer. Some lowered their weapons, others wept. In that fragile moment, the violence subsided. The king and queen, shaken and pale, appeared together on the balcony. Lafayette raised his sword to the air. The people shouted again, this time not for blood, but for Paris. They demanded that the royal family return with them to the capital, to live among their people, to see the hunger they had ignored. Louis XV agreed. He had no choice. And so, on October 6, 1789, the royal procession began, a sight that no one in France would ever forget. The king's carriage rolled slowly down the road to Paris, surrounded by an ocean of people. Before it marched the women of the markets, singing and laughing, their faces still wet from rain and tears. Some carried pikes topped not with loaves of bread, but with the heads of guards slain at Versailles, grim trophies of justice or vengeance, depending on who watched. Behind them came wagons filled with flour and grain, the very bread they had demanded, and behind those the National Guard, weary but proud, their bayonets gleaming in the pale light of dawn. As the procession entered Paris, bells rang from every church tower. Crowds filled the streets cheering wildly. The baker, the baker's wife, and the little baker's boy, they cried, mocking, triumphant, victorious. The king and queen were no longer distant figures in marble halls. They were captives of their own people, carried not by grace, but by necessity. At the palace of the Tuileries, the royal family would now live under the watchful eyes of Paris, prisoners in all but name. And though no one yet knew it, the road that began with bread would one day lead to the blade. But for now that long strange march ended with a kind of fragile peace. The people had brought their king home, and outside the palace gates, as the lamps flickered in the cool October air, Paris exhaled, tired, triumphant, hungry still, but no longer afraid. The sun rose over Paris on the morning of October 7th, 1789, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the King of France awoke not in a palace of gold, but in a palace of stone, a prisoner of his own people. The royal family now lived in the Tuileries Palace, once a summer retreat of kings, now surrounded by restless crowds and guarded by the National Guard. The great halls, stripped of their old splendor, echoed with silence. Gone were the endless banquets, the bowing courtiers, the ceremonies of dawn and dusk. Versailles, the golden world of mirrors and music, was behind them, and it would never return. For Louis XVI, this new life was both bewildering and unbearable. He had always seen himself as the father of his people. Yet here he was, confined within his own capital, watched day and night by citizens who once called him sire. He rose early, prayed, tinkered with locks and maps, quiet hobbies to fill the emptiness, and looked out the window to the gardens below, where soldiers patrolled and children played with wooden guillotines carved by their fathers. Marie Antoinette, once the dazzling queen of fashion, now walked the corridors in plain dresses, her jewels locked away, her laughter gone. She read, sewed, and played the harp for her children, the little Dauphin Louis Charles and his sister Marie-Thérèse, trying to build a fragile world of calm within the walls of fear. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Paris had become the heart of the revolution, and the heart of the revolution never slept. Pamphlets poured from every printer's shop, each sharper than the last. Newspapers mocked the king's weakness, the queen's extravagance, the nobility's flight. In the taverns, men toasted liberty and plotted change. In the streets, soldiers of the National Guard drilled with pride, their tricolour cockades bright against their hats. And over it all, the National Assembly, now relocated to Paris, worked day and night, reshaping the nation. Feudal privileges were gone, the church was being reformed, and a constitution, a document that would limit the king's power, was being written. For centuries, France had been a kingdom. Now it was becoming something else, a nation. But for every reform, there was resistance. Many nobles had fled abroad, gathering in foreign courts, whispering of vengeance. The church raged at losing its lands. And within the Tuileries the king hesitated, uncertain whether to embrace or resist the tide. He still wore his crown, but its weight had changed. It was no longer a symbol of divine right. It was a burden of survival. Each day the crowds gathered outside the palace gates, shouting up at the windows. Sometimes they cheered, asking for blessings. Sometimes they jeered, demanding the queen's head. The queen became a figure of obsession, blamed for every ill, every hunger, every failure. Madame Deficit, they called her, the Austrian who had come to bleed France dry. She rarely appeared in public now, and when she did, she held her chin high, her expression unreadable. To bow to the mob was to admit defeat. To defy them was to court death. Her every gesture, her every glance was watched. The smallest smile could be twisted into insult. The smallest tear could be seen as guilt. The palace itself became a cage of mirrors, every reflection showing a different truth. And yet within those walls there was still a flicker of royal dignity. The king continued his rituals, attended mass, received ministers. The queen taught her children to curtsy, to pray, to never forget who they were, even as the world forgot. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Paris was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The revolution had brought not only hope, but chaos. Prices rose, bread remained scarce, and the city's poor, who had once seen the king as the source of their suffering, now turned their anger toward one another. Factions began to form. The moderates of the assembly wanted reform, the radicals demanded revolution, and from those radicals emerged new voices, sharp, fearless, and relentless. Jean-Paul Marat, with his fiery newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, wrote from a cramped cellar, urging the masses to stay vigilant, to suspect all who stood in the way of liberty. Georges Danton, loud and charismatic, rallied the crowds in the clubs and cafes, preaching unity and strength. And in the shadows, Maximilien Robespierre, precise, idealistic, incorruptible, began to rise, his quiet words carrying the weight of prophecy. All of them spoke of freedom, but they did not always mean the same thing. For the king, freedom meant peace, a return to order, to stability. For the radicals, it meant transformation, even destruction if needed. The two visions could not coexist forever. In the winter of 1789, the National Assembly presented the king with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that radiant manifesto of liberty. He hesitated, as he always did, then finally approved it. But approval did not mean belief. Privately, Louis still saw himself as the guardian of the old world, of faith, of hierarchy, of the divine order. He prayed that time would restore what rebellion had broken. Marie Antoinette prayed too, but her prayers turned toward escape. She wrote letters to her brother, the Emperor of Austria, pleading for help. She met secretly with loyal courtiers, plotting a way out. Each day in Paris, she said, was a humiliation, a death by inches. The guards, though loyal to the revolution, were human. Some pitied the royal children. Some turned their eyes when messages passed through the palace gates. And beyond those gates, Europe was watching. The kings of Austria and Prussia looked upon France with fear and with opportunity. The revolution, once a French affair, was becoming a European crisis. Still, the days passed in uneasy rhythm. The king hunted in the Bois de Boulogne, escorted by guards who were more jailers than protectors. The queen embroidered by candlelight. The children played, unaware of the shadow growing over their cradle. At night, the city outside flickered with the light of 1,000 lamps, each one a sign of life, of liberty, of unrest. The wind carried songs of freedom and the faint tolling of church bells repurposed as alarm. And above it all, the palace stood silent, a monument to the past, surrounded by the heartbeat of the new. By 1790, the revolution had entered its second act. The first had destroyed the old order, the second sought to rebuild. The Assembly passed laws to strip the church of property, to reorganize the provinces, to redefine the very meaning of citizenship. Each reform, bold and idealistic, chipped further at the throne. The king signed them all, but with trembling hand. His seal still marked the documents of France, but his spirit was fading. Each signature was a surrender, each decree a reminder that the crown no longer commanded. It consented. And though Paris slept each night beneath a thin blanket of peace, beneath it ran a deep current of unease. For the king and queen, the walls of the Tuileries felt closer each day. For the people, the promises of liberty felt further away. Something had to give. And soon, on a dark June night, under the quiet cover of a city half asleep, the king would try to reclaim his freedom the only way left to him, by running. Paris slept uneasily that night. The lamps along the Seine flickered in the warm June wind. The streets lay quiet, and the sound of distant hooves echoed faintly over cobblestone. But behind the walls of the Tuileries Palace, the silence was different. It was thick, deliberate, filled with the rustle of cloaks, the whisper of keys, the creak of boots against stone. For months, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had lived as captives in their own kingdom, watched by guards and mocked by pamphlets. Their letters were intercepted, their movements restricted, their dignity worn thin by the daily gaze of the revolution. And so, on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king decided to do what kings were never supposed to do. He decided to flee. The plan was simple, on paper. The royal family would disguise themselves, slip out of the city under cover of darkness, and ride east toward the fortress town of Montmédy, near the border of the Austrian Netherlands. There loyal troops waited, and from there Louis hoped to rally France, restore order, and negotiate as a monarch once more. It was a plan of desperation, not cunning. As the palace clock struck 10, the queen dressed her children in peasant clothes. The little Dauphin Louis Charles yawned and rubbed his eyes, too young to understand why his mother's hands trembled as she fastened his cloak. The Princess Marie-Thérèse wept silently. Marie Antoinette wore a simple bonnet and a dark cloak. The king, broad and ungraceful, was disguised as a valet, Monsieur Durand, with his valet playing the role of a noble. It was a comedy of masks, except no one was laughing. At a side door of the palace, a small carriage waited. The night air smelled of wet stone and horse sweat. A coachman tipped his hat. The family climbed in. The wheels creaked softly as the carriage rolled into the sleeping city. Behind them, Paris breathed, unaware that its king was vanishing into the dark. For a time, the plan worked. The first gates opened, then the second. The guards, sleepy and half-drunk, saluted the disguised travelers. The carriage moved along the empty boulevards, past shuttered shops and silent churches. But as the horses trotted through the city's edge, a sense of slowness began to weigh on them. The royal carriage was large, ornate, heavy. It was no vehicle for escape. It was a moving monument. The horses strained. The wheels rumbled loudly over the cobblestones. Hours turned into dawn. They were far beyond Paris now, the fields misty and pale. The king, relieved, leaned back in his seat and allowed himself a small sigh. He spoke softly to his children, telling them they were on an adventure, that soon they would be safe. But safety, like crowns, was an illusion. At every posting station, delays mounted. The horses were late. The guards loyal to the crown were uncertain, afraid to act without orders. Word spread ahead of them. Travelers speaking of a suspiciously large carriage, of a woman who looked like the queen. By midday, the disguise was wearing thin. Louis's round face, his awkward manner, his unmistakable air of royal dignity, all of it made him impossible to hide. At Saint-Menehould, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet noticed something odd. He had seen the king's portrait on coins and in gazettes. Now, looking at the tall man in the carriage, he saw the same pale features, the same heavy chin. He watched as the coach rolled away, his suspicion hardening into certainty. Without hesitation, he mounted his horse and rode after them into the dusk. The royal carriage pressed on toward Varennes, a small town near the border. The plan was to cross the river there, rest briefly, and then reach Montmedy by morning. But as they arrived in the dead of night, something was wrong. The streets were dark, the town asleep. The bridge ahead was blocked. Torches flared suddenly in the distance. Drouet had arrived first, warning the local mayor. The bell of Varennes began to toll. The king's carriage halted. Soldiers appeared with muskets. Townsfolk, roused from their beds, surrounded the coach. The queen clutched her children tightly, whispering for them not to cry. Louis stepped out, calm and grave. He did not order, did not plead. He simply said, "I am your king." But the word no longer meant what it once had. The townspeople stared, uncertain whether to kneel or shout. Finally, one voice answered, "You are our king no longer." The night air filled with murmurs, torches flickering against the dark river. The mayor invited the royal family into his house, offering food and chairs. The king sat silently, his great hands folded on the table, while messengers galloped toward Paris, with news that would shatter the city. At dawn, the streets of Varennes were packed with citizens, farmers, merchants, soldiers, all staring at their captured monarch. Marie Antoinette sat pale and still, her son asleep in her lap. Her eyes were dry, her pride remained. Louis, his wig askew, stared at the floor. They had not reached their fortress. They had not reached freedom. They had reached the end of illusion. By evening, a new procession began, not of triumph, but of shame. The royal carriage was turned around, escorted by National Guardsmen and an armed crowd, back toward Paris. The journey that had begun in secrecy now became a spectacle. In every village they passed, the people gathered along the road to watch. Some wept, remembering the king as the man who once blessed their children. Others shouted curses, holding up the new tricolour flags. "No more kings!" they cried. "No more tyranny!" The queen kept her gaze fixed forward. Louis tried to smile, nodding gently to those who looked at him, a gesture half paternal, half tragic. When they reached Paris on June 25th, the silence was heavier than any roar. Tens of thousands lined the streets, but no one cheered. The crowd was ordered not to speak, not to shout. The only sound was the rumble of wheels, the clatter of hooves, and the faint creak of the royal carriage as it rolled slowly toward the Tuileries. Through the windows, Louis could see the faces, endless rows of faces, cold and expressionless like statues. The king who had tried to flee his people had returned, not as ruler, but as prisoner. That night, as the palace gates closed behind them, Paris felt different. Something invisible had broken. The fragile trust between monarch and people, the belief that the king might still be one of them, was gone. In the assembly, debate turned to fury. Some demanded the king's abdication, others whispered of treason. A few still argued for mercy, but their voices grew smaller each day. Louis insisted he had not fled, only gone to seek safety. No one believed him. The people had seen their king in flight, and that image and of crown and fear together could never be unseen. Across France, the revolution hardened. The language of reform gave way to the language of vigilance. Liberty, once gentle and idealistic, began to wear a sterner face. For if a king could betray his people, then who could be trusted? In the flickering candlelight of the assembly, a young deputy, pale, intense, deliberate, rose to speak. His name was Robespierre. His words were quiet, but they cut through the chamber like a blade. "The king must die," he said, "so that the nation may live." And though his meaning was not yet literal, the shadow of those words stretched far and long, across the corridors of the Tuileries, across the restless streets of Paris, across history itself. The king had returned to Paris, but not as a sovereign. He returned as a ghost. When the royal carriage passed beneath the iron gates of the Tuileries on that silent June evening of 1791, the revolution entered a new chapter, one written in suspicion, fear, and slow betrayal. Louis XVI had fled from his people. Now he was their captive. In the months that followed the flight to Varennes, the air of France changed. The summer light seemed harsher, the voices sharper. Where once there had been talk of reform, now there was only talk of punishment. The National Assembly debated day and night. Some deputies argued that the king's attempted escape had voided his authority, that he should be dethroned, even tried. Others, the moderates, pleaded for mercy, warning that to destroy the monarchy entirely would plunge the nation into chaos. But outside the assembly, in the streets and the clubs, the people had already made up their minds. They gathered in the gardens of the Champ de Mars, where once they had celebrated the storming of the Bastille. Now they came to sign petitions demanding the king's abdication. The crowd was vast, their voices steady, until soldiers arrived to disperse them. Shots rang out. Men and women fell onto the grass. The green field of liberty was stained with blood. After that day, the illusion of unity shattered forever. Paris no longer spoke with one voice. In the assembly, the factions hardened: the Girondins, moderate republicans seeking compromise, the Jacobins, fierce and unyielding defenders of equality, and within the Jacobins themselves, the rising figure of Robespierre, whose calm words began to sound like commandments. The revolution, once a movement of reason, began to turn upon itself. Meanwhile, across Europe, the crowned heads of the world watched in alarm. The King of Prussia, the Emperor of Austria, Marie Antoinette's brother, and the rulers of Spain and England whispered of intervention. They feared the contagion of liberty spreading across their borders, and in the autumn of 1791 they made their intentions known. The Declaration of Pillnitz, issued by Austria and Prussia, warned that any harm done to the French royal family would provoke war. The words, meant as threat, became fuel for fury. To the people of Paris it confirmed their deepest fear, that their king was not one of them, but a traitor, conspiring with foreign powers to crush the revolution. The atmosphere thickened with paranoia. Pamphlets accused the Queen of treason, of sending secret letters across the border, of planning the return of tyranny. Some even called her the Austrian she-wolf, the enemy within the palace walls. The king, silent and withdrawn, seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. He no longer spoke publicly, no longer ruled, he merely waited. But the revolution was not waiting. In April 1792, under pressure from the Girondins, France declared war on Austria. It was meant to defend liberty. Instead, it nearly destroyed it. The French army, poorly trained and divided by politics, marched to the front singing of freedom and promptly fell into chaos. Officers deserted, soldiers mutinied, and the enemy advanced. Panic swept the nation. Back in Paris, fear turned to rage. If the army was failing, the people said, it must be because traitors were betraying it from within. And where better to find traitors than in the Tuileries itself, in the palace where the king still lived under guard? Every rumor became a weapon. By the summer of 1792, the capital was a furnace. Bread was scarce again. The currency was collapsing. Pamphlets screamed that the royal family planned to open the city gates to the enemy. The bells of Notre Dame tolled not for prayer but for alarm. On August 10, 1792, Paris exploded. It began before dawn. Thousands of citizens, men, women, even children, armed themselves with pikes, muskets, and kitchen knives. The tocsin bells rang from every steeple, the streets filled with chanting, "Down with the king, long live the nation." The National Guard, now commanded by revolutionaries rather than royalists, joined the marchers. At their head stood the sans-culottes, the working people of Paris, fierce, unshaven, determined. They wore no fancy breeches, no lace, only defiance. The crowd surged toward the Tuileries like a tide. The palace guards, the Swiss Guard, elite soldiers in scarlet uniforms, stood ready, their muskets loaded, their faces pale. Inside, Louis XV sat in his study, trembling hands folded. He had waited for this moment for months, and now that it had come, he seemed strangely calm. He looked at his wife, his children. He murmured that he would rather die than see blood spilled, but he did not move to stop what was coming. The crowd reached the palace gates. Words turned to shouts, shouts to gunfire. Smoke filled the courtyards as the first shots cracked through the air. The Swiss Guard held their ground, firing volley after volley into the mob. The mob, enraged, surged forward again and again. At last the king was persuaded to flee, not from the city but across the gardens to the Legislative Assembly, seeking protection. He walked through the palace corridors as the walls shook with cannon fire. He wore a simple coat, a hat pulled low. Marie Antoinette followed, clutching the children's hands. As they stepped into the sunlight, the roar of the crowd drowned all else. By the time they reached the assembly, the Tuileries was in flames. The Swiss Guard were massacred, hundreds cut down by sabres and pikes. Blood ran through the marble halls where courtiers once danced. The monarchy of France had fallen not by decree but by force. When the king entered the assembly chamber, the deputies rose in uneasy silence. The monarch who had once sat upon a throne now stood before them as a man without power, without crown. He bowed his head and said simply, "I have come here to place myself under the protection of the law." But there was no law left to protect him. Outside, Paris was delirious. The revolution had devoured its father. Bells rang from every steeple. The tricolour flew above the ruins of the Tuileries. That night, the Assembly voted to suspend the monarchy. Louis XVI would remain in custody to be tried as a citizen. The royal family was moved to the Temple, a former medieval fortress in the heart of Paris, colder, darker, smaller than any prison they could have imagined. They were no longer majesty, they were simply citizen Capet. The people of France rejoiced. Some sang through the night, others wept from joy. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, France was without a king. But revolutions, like fires, rarely stop where they begin. The fall of the monarchy did not bring peace. It opened the door to new dangers, both within and beyond. Across the borders, enemy armies gathered, promising to crush this new republic before it could take root. Within the city, factions sharpened their knives, Girondins against Jacobins, moderates against radicals. And in the darkness of the temple, Louis XVI sat with his family, reading his Bible, praying quietly for a nation that no longer prayed for him. In the streets outside, the cries of liberty still rang out. But liberty, the people were beginning to learn, is not a gift. It is a fire that must be fed, and fire, once unleashed, has no master. The crown was gone, the throne was empty, and in that emptiness, the revolution was just beginning to find its most dangerous power. The belief that no one was above the will of the people, not even a king. The throne of France stood empty. Its gold still gleamed in the torchlight, but its power had dissolved like smoke in the air. The monarch had fallen, and in his place rose a new idea, a nation without a crown, a republic born from the ruins of 1,000 years. The Temple prison in Paris was silent that autumn. Its thick stone walls, once home to medieval knights, now echoed with the murmurs of a dethroned family. Inside a dimly lit chamber, Louis XVI, no longer Your Majesty, sat beside a small table reading from his worn Bible. His wife Marie Antoinette sewed in silence, her fingers pale and trembling. Their children, the Dauphin Louis Charles and Princess Marie-Thérèse, slept on a straw mattress. Outside, the streets rumbled with drums and shouts. The monarchy was gone, and the First French Republic had been proclaimed on September 21, 1792. But liberty was not peace. War thundered at the borders. The Austrian and Prussian armies, joined by exiled French nobles, marched toward the frontiers, promising to restore the king. Inside France, the revolution devoured itself. Suspicion, paranoia, and vengeance flowed faster than wine. The city was alive, but feverish. The National Convention, now the Supreme Assembly, gathered beneath the motto, liberty, equality, fraternity. But behind those words stood a darker question. Could liberty survive while the former king still lived? It was Robespierre who first spoke the thought aloud. His voice was calm, deliberate, almost gentle. "Louis must die," he said, "so that the Republic may live." His meaning was not cruelty, it was conviction. To Robespierre and his allies, as long as Louis lived, tyranny had a face, and Europe had a symbol to fight for. To kill the king was to kill the idea of kingship itself. The Girondins, the more moderate faction, protested. They spoke of mercy, of due process, of avoiding bloodshed. Exile him, some said. Imprison him forever. But the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, Danton and Marat, would not yield. "A nation cannot be reborn with its executioner still breathing," Danton thundered. And so the trial began. On December 11, 1792, Louis XVI was brought before the convention. The hall was packed. Deputies, guards, scribes and spectators pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting in the cold air. Louis stood calmly at the bar, dressed in black, his hair powdered grey. He looked neither defiant nor broken. "My conscience is clear," he said quietly. "I have always desired the happiness of my people." But the charges read like thunderclaps, conspiring with foreign powers, betraying the Constitution, waging war against the liberty of his people. Each word was a nail driven into a coffin not yet built. As witnesses testified, the city outside seethed. Pamphlets demanded justice. The cafes and taverns buzzed with rumors. In the markets, women shouted, "No more kings! Give us bread and freedom!" For weeks the debate raged. Deputies argued late into the night, their speeches echoing through the marble halls. Could a nation that claimed to be just commit such an act? Could the people of France, who once adored their monarch, now cut off his head? When the vote came in January, it was agonizingly close. Out of 721 deputies, a narrow majority declared him guilty. Then came the question that would decide history, life or death. Each deputy rose one by one to declare his answer. Death. 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 The words fell like stones into silence. When it ended, the tally was final. 361 for death, 360 against. One vote decided the fate of a king. On the morning of January 21, 1793, a grey winter mist lay heavy over Paris. Bells tolled, the drums rolled, the streets filled with citizens, not cheering, not jeering, only watching. A carriage rattled through the snow toward the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine waited. Soldiers lined the route. Windows were shuttered. From every alley, faces peered out, the old, the poor, the curious. Inside the carriage, Louis sat upright, his hands bound. He looked out through the small window and saw the faces of his people, faces once turned toward him with loyalty, now with something unreadable. When he stepped from the carriage, the cold air bit his cheeks. He climbed the wooden steps slowly, one hand steadying himself on the rail. His confessor walked beside him, whispering prayers. The drums thundered, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. Louis turned to the executioner and said softly, "I die innocent of all crimes. I forgive those who are the cause of my death. May my blood cement the happiness of the French people." He tried to speak further, but the drums grew louder. The blade flashed once in the pale light, and in an instant the age of kings was over. The crowd gasped, then stood still. The executioner held up the head for all to see. Blood dripped onto the wooden planks. A single voice shouted, "Vive la République!" Tens of thousands took up the cry. The sound rippled across the square, through the streets, and into the heart of history. Back in the temple, Marie Antoinette heard the distant roar. She said nothing. She simply lowered her sewing, bowed her head, and prayed. Paris that night was silent again. No fireworks, no celebration, only the sound of the river and the soft beat of the drums being carried away. In the convention, deputies sat motionless. Even those who had voted for death felt the weight of what they had done. They had killed not just a man, but an institution, a millennium of divine right and royal order. France had no king now, only the Republic, standing tall and trembling on unsteady legs. Yet even as liberty rang in the air, darkness gathered. The execution of the king did not end the revolution's enemies, it multiplied them. Across Europe, monarchs shuddered in horror. Armies rallied under banners of vengeance. France found itself surrounded by war, and within its own borders, the revolution began to eat itself. The Girondins and the Jacobins turned from allies to rivals. The people, drunk on freedom and fear, demanded purity. Anyone who questioned the revolution became an enemy. From the blood of a king, a new power was born, one far more ruthless, far more certain, and far more dangerous. Robespierre's quiet conviction hardened into law. Danton's booming laughter became the sound of command. The Committee of Public Safety rose, promising to defend the Republic at any cost. And as the guillotine was wiped clean, another name was already being whispered for its blade. Next, they said, must come the Queen. But for now, in that quiet between storms, The revolution stood still, a world reborn, a king dead, and a people uncertain whether what they had created was freedom or something else entirely. The blade had fallen, and silence followed. For a moment, France held its breath, as though uncertain whether it had just committed an act of justice or one of damnation. The king was dead, the republic was born, and the air trembled with the promise of freedom. Yet like all newborn things, that freedom cried out in pain. Outside the borders, kings trembled. Inside them, France burned. The winter of 1793 was harsh, grey, and hungry. The revolution that had begun with words, liberty, equality, fraternity, now spoke in the language of survival. Bread was scarce. War raged on every frontier. Rebellion stirred in the countryside. And in Paris, the heartbeat of the revolution began to quicken into something feverish, something cruel. The National Convention declared that the nation was in danger. To save it, they created a new power, the Committee of Public Safety. 12 men, chosen from among the most radical revolutionaries, would now guide the Republic with absolute authority. Among them sat Maximilien Robespierre, thin and pale, his expression calm as glass. His words carried no fury, only certainty. He believed that virtue was the soul of the Republic, but that virtue, if it was to survive, must wield terror as its weapon. And so began the Reign of Terror. At first it was meant to protect the revolution from enemies, but the definition of enemy began to change. It no longer meant royalists or traitors. It meant anyone who hesitated, anyone who questioned, anyone who whispered. The guillotine, once a symbol of equality before the law, became the instrument of fear. Day after day, its blade rose and fell in the Place de la Révolution, slicing through the morning mist. The crowd gathered not out of bloodlust, but habit. They ate their bread, drank their wine, and watched the executions as though it were a grim theatre. Among the condemned were nobles and priests, soldiers and farmers, even former revolutionaries who had once cheered the fall of the king. The revolution, it seemed, had learned to turn its blade inward, and soon it found its most famous victim, Marie Antoinette. The queen, once adorned in jewels and silks, was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal in October 1793. Her face was pale, her hair cut short, her dress plain. She stood in the courtroom with the same poise she had once shown at Versailles. They accused her of treason, of conspiring with foreign powers, of corrupting her son, of crimes that no defense could disprove. When asked to speak, she said nothing of politics. She simply raised her head and said, "I was a good mother." At dawn on October 16th, she rode in an open cart through the streets of Paris, past the ruins of her own world. The people stared, some with pity, others with hatred. She climbed the scaffold without trembling. The blade fell. The queen's head rolled into the basket, and the crowd shouted again, "Vive la République!" But even as her blood soaked the wood, the Republic's heart darkened. In the provinces, rebellion spread. The Vendée, a region in the west, rose in arms against Paris, peasants, priests and royalists fighting under the sign of the Sacred Heart. They were crushed mercilessly. Whole villages were burned. The Loire River ran red with the bodies of the drowned. In the capital, paranoia grew. The Girondins, once powerful moderates, were arrested. Their leaders, including Brissot and Vergniaud, mounted the scaffold, denouncing tyranny with their last breath. "Liberty," one said before the blade fell. "How many crimes are committed in thy name?" Robespierre watched all of it with the composure of a man convinced he was saving the soul of the nation. He spoke not of power, but of purity. "Terror," he said, "is only justice. Prompt, severe, inflexible. It is virtue's instrument." To him, France was a garden, and the guillotine was the gardener's knife. To prune was to preserve. Under the committee's rule, new laws stripped away old rights. A law of suspects declared that anyone who showed signs of counter-revolutionary spirit could be arrested. Neighbors denounced neighbors, brothers betrayed brothers. The prisons filled faster than the executioner's cart could empty them. Each morning lists were posted. Each evening the condemned marched to the scaffold, silent, resigned, often singing the Marseillaise until the drums drowned their voices. In those days, the revolution became a religion of fear. New festivals celebrated reason instead of God. Statues of saints were torn down, replaced with the goddess of liberty. The churches stood empty, echoing with dust and lost faith. And yet, amid the terror, some still believed. They believed that this suffering, this cleansing, would lead to a purer France, a nation reborn through fire. But even fire burns what it means to save. By the spring of 1794, the revolution had begun to consume its own children. Danton, the great orator who once cried, "Audacity, more audacity," began to speak of moderation. "Enough blood," he pleaded. "Let France learn to live again." Robespierre heard his words and saw only weakness. Danton was arrested. At his trial, he roared like a lion, calling his accusers cowards, hypocrites, fools. When the blade fell, the crowd cheered, but uneasily. They had loved Danton once, now he was gone. Robespierre stood alone, the incorruptible guardian of virtue. Yet even he began to see enemies in every shadow. The air around him grew colder, thinner. He spoke less of justice, more of purity. He saw corruption everywhere, in the convention, in his allies, even in those who once called him friend. In June 1794, the festival of the Supreme Being filled the streets with color. Robespierre, dressed in a blue coat, led the parade like a prophet. He spoke of divine virtue, of moral rebirth. But behind the smiles, his colleagues watched him with suspicion. They whispered that he no longer served the Republic, only himself. And all across Paris, people began to ask in whispers, "Who will save us from the Savior?" By midsummer, the guillotine's shadow stretched long and thin. Nearly 40,000 people had died. Nobles, peasants, revolutionaries, mothers, poets. The air of Paris smelled of iron and fear. The revolution had devoured nearly everything it had promised to protect, and as the last heads rolled in the Place de la Révolution, one could almost imagine the statues of liberty and reason weeping, not for kings or queens, but for the dream that had begun with such hope and ended in such terror. The city slept uneasily, as if afraid to wake. The revolution was no longer a cry of freedom. It was a heartbeat of survival, fragile, feverish, and fast. But even in that darkness, something stirred, the faint beginning of rebellion, not against tyranny, but against terror itself. Soon, the blade that had silenced so many would turn toward the men who built it. And as dawn broke over Paris, casting its cold light on the blood-stained square, France was left to wonder, had liberty triumphed, or had it simply changed its name? By the summer of 1794, the revolution had eaten nearly all its children. Paris was quieter now, but not at peace. The silence was the silence of exhaustion, of fear so constant it became ordinary. The air was heavy with smoke and suspicion. The guillotine stood in the Place de la Révolution, its blade glinting in the afternoon sun, no longer an object of awe or even horror, merely routine, a machine of habit. France had survived invasion. It had silenced rebellion. It had destroyed its kings and queens, its nobles and priests, its moderates and radicals alike. But the revolution, having conquered every enemy, now faced the one enemy it could not defeat: itself. At its center stood Maximilien Robespierre, pale, serene, incorruptible, and utterly alone. To his followers, he was the voice of virtue, the guardian of liberty's flame. To his enemies, he had become a new tyrant, cloaked not in gold, but in righteousness. And to the people of Paris, he was something stranger still, both savior and spectre, the man who promised paradise through purity and delivered death through principle. He no longer laughed, no longer smiled. His speech was calm, precise, and without mercy. He spoke of the Republic as though it were sacred scripture. He spoke of vice as though it were sin. And every speech ended with the same invisible punctuation, the sound of the guillotine's blade falling somewhere nearby. In the convention, where once voices had clashed and debates had raged, now only whispers remained. Deputies feared to speak, to question, to glance at each other too long. One wrong word could be a death sentence. The Committee of Public Safety, once a council of equals, now bent around Robespierre like planets around the sun. He was not its head by law, but by force of belief. He was the revolution made flesh, austere, sleepless, and absolute. But even suns burn out. By July 1794, something in Robespierre began to shift. He appeared in the convention less often, avoiding his colleagues, claiming illness. When he did appear, he spoke of invisible enemies, conspiracies hidden even within the committee itself. One afternoon, he took the podium and delivered one of his longest, strangest speeches. His voice was low, deliberate, hypnotic. "There are traitors among us," he declared, "men who have betrayed the Republic from within. I will not name them yet, but I will soon." The deputies froze. Every man felt the blade's shadow on his neck. Robespierre's refusal to name names was worse than naming them. It turned suspicion into air, filling every corner of the hall. That night, no one slept. Each deputy believed the morning might bring his arrest. And in that sleeplessness, a quiet rebellion began to take shape. Among the first to stir was Tallien, a once loyal Jacobin now weary of blood. Around him gathered others, Barras, Collot d'Herbois, Fouché, men who had enforced terror and now feared being devoured by it. They spoke softly, but their words carried the scent of danger. "If we do not strike him down, he will strike us first." Meanwhile, Robespierre retreated to the Jacobins' club, where his followers still adored him. They called him the Incorruptible. They swore to protect him. And yet, even among them, the devotion was thinning. Paris was hungry, tired, and beginning to whisper that liberty had turned into another kind of throne. On July 26th, Robespierre appeared again before the convention. The chamber fell silent as he climbed the rostrum. His face was pale, his eyes fever-bright. He spoke for 2 hours. He accused no one by name, yet everyone felt accused. He spoke of monsters who mock virtue, of traitors hiding behind patriotism. His words were fire wrapped in silk, mesmerizing, terrifying, and absolute. When he finished, the deputies sat in stunned quiet. For the first time, no one applauded. Then, slowly, murmurs began to ripple through the hall. Someone whispered, "He means us." Another said, "He will destroy us all." That evening, the plot hardened. While Robespierre dined with a few loyal friends, his enemies met in secret. They decided that the revolution's savior must die, for the revolution to live. At dawn on July 27, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor, by the new revolutionary calendar, Robespierre arrived at the convention unaware that his name was already being erased from history. He took his seat. The atmosphere was electric, thick with tension. Then a deputy named Saint-Just, Robespierre's young ally, rose to speak in his defense. But before he could finish his first sentence, Tallien interrupted. "We are all weary of this tyranny," he shouted. "Down with the dictator!" The hall erupted. Deputies pounded their desks, shouting, "Down with the tyrant! Down with Robespierre!" Robespierre stood, pale as death. "Who will dare accuse me?" he cried. "I dare!" Tallien thundered, brandishing a pistol. The chamber exploded into chaos. Votes were shouted, guards summoned, papers torn. The once revered leader was declared outlawed, beyond protection, beyond trial. That night, Robespierre fled to the Hôtel de Ville, where the Paris Commune, still loyal to him, tried to rally support. But Paris did not rise. The people who had once cheered his words stayed in their houses. The drums of the National Guard echoed through the streets, not for him, but against him. At midnight, soldiers stormed the hotel. Shots rang out. In the confusion, Robespierre was found with a shattered jaw. Whether by his own hand or another's, no one knew. His face was drenched in blood, his voice silenced at last. He was taken to the same prison where he had once sent so many. The next day, July 28, 1794, the blade of the guillotine gleamed under the hot sun. The crowd gathered, not with hatred, but with a strange relief, the kind that comes when a long fever breaks. One by one, Robespierre and his closest allies were led to the scaffold. Saint-Just, barely 26, walked proudly, saying, "I have seen the face of the future, and it is beautiful." When Robespierre's turn came, his broken jaw was bound in blood-stained linen. He could not speak. The drums rolled, drowning out the faint groans as he was laid beneath the blade. At 6:15 in the evening, the knife fell, and with it, the terror ended. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in sighs. 1,000 lives seemed to breathe again. The city, long smothered in silence and fear, exhaled. The guillotine, still stained with the blood of kings and revolutionaries alike, stood in the sun like a monument to the madness of ideals. Paris that night was strange, quiet, almost gentle. The stars hung low above the Seine, reflected in the water like lanterns. People whispered in the streets, "It is over." But nothing in history ever ends so easily. The revolution, though quieter now, was not finished. It had merely shed another of its faces. In the ashes of terror, a new age would rise, one of weary pragmatism, of generals and ambition, of a young soldier who watched from afar and learned what power truly meant. The blade had fallen for the last time on virtue's most devoted servant. And in the silence that followed, another kind of voice began to stir, the voice of order, of discipline, of destiny, the voice of Napoleon Bonaparte. Paris, at last, was quiet. The summer of 1794 faded into autumn, and the echo of the guillotine grew fainter each day. The terror had ended, not with a revolution, but with a whisper, a collective sigh of relief that the fever had finally broken. The revolution, exhausted and trembling, stood before its own reflection and hardly recognized what it had become. The streets no longer ran with blood, but they were lined with ghosts. Names once spoken with reverence, Danton, Desmoulins, Robespierre, now hung like shadows over the republic they had built. And though France was free, the meaning of freedom itself had changed. In the cafes, people spoke again in low voices, fearful yet curious, asking the same question: what now? The National Convention, once the voice of the revolution, struggled to govern the chaos it had unleashed. Inflation soared. The assignat, France's paper currency, was worth almost nothing. Bread was scarce. Soldiers at the front fought not for ideals, but for survival. The people wanted peace. The leaders wanted order. And from those twin hungers, peace and order, something new began to rise. The Directory, a new government of 5 men, replaced the Committee of Public Safety. It promised stability, but it was weak, corrupt, and constantly at war with itself. Deputies plotted in the shadows, generals grew ambitious, and the people, weary of speeches and purges, longed for a strong hand to guide them. It was during this weary peace that a young man from Corsica, small in stature, sharp in mind, and filled with restless fire, stepped quietly into history. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was 25 years old, a general by talent more than rank, his rise accelerated by the revolution's chaos. He had grown up in a family of minor nobility, educated in French military schools, mocked for his accent and his island pride. But what others saw as arrogance was ambition, cold, steady, unyielding. He had seen the revolution devour its heroes, and he had learned a simple lesson: ideals alone could not rule a nation. In 1793, he first tasted fame at Toulon, where royalist rebels and British forces threatened the Republic. His daring plan to seize the heights and drive out the enemy succeeded brilliantly. His artillery roared, and when the smoke cleared, Toulon was French again. Paris took notice. The Republic, desperate for victories to justify its survival, found a new champion in this sharp-eyed, calculating young man. Years passed, and with each campaign, Napoleon's legend grew. In 1795, when royalists rose once more in Paris, he was called to defend the convention itself. Standing before the advancing mob, he gave the order that changed his life: give them a whiff of grape shot. Cannons thundered through the narrow streets. The uprising was crushed. The Republic was saved, but Paris knew that something colder, more decisive, had entered its veins. The Directory rewarded him with command of the Army of Italy, a ragged, starving force. And in the spring of 1796, Napoleon led them across the Alps into history. He moved with the speed of thought, striking Austrian armies before they could react. His soldiers adored him, his enemies feared him. He spoke to them not as a general, but as a prophet. "Soldiers," he told them, "you are naked and hungry. I will lead you to the most fertile plains on earth. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. And he kept his promise. Victory followed victory. Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, and battles fought with genius and audacity. The French army, long starved and beaten, now marched like a force of destiny. In each conquered city, Napoleon's name spread like fire. While Paris bickered, he conquered. While the politicians schemed, he dreamed. In 1798 he turned his gaze to Egypt, chasing visions of empire and ancient glory. He brought with him not only soldiers but scientists and scholars, the revolution's intellect marching beside its guns. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he stood before his men and cried, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It was history speaking to history, the conqueror saluting the past he was about to eclipse. But the sands of Egypt swallowed many dreams. His fleet destroyed at Aboukir Bay by Admiral Nelson, Napoleon was cut off from France. And yet through cunning and will he returned, slipping across the Mediterranean in secrecy, landing in France to find his homeland again in crisis. The Directory was collapsing. The economy was broken. The wars dragged on endlessly. The people were hungry for peace, but more than that, for certainty. Napoleon offered both. On November 9th, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire, in the strange calendar of the Revolution, soldiers marched through Paris under his command. The Directory fell without a fight. The Revolution, begun with words in the streets, ended with boots on the marble floors of power. A new government was formed, the Consulate. Napoleon named himself First Consul, a title borrowed from ancient Rome, where dictators once ruled in times of emergency. He promised to restore stability, end corruption, rebuild France, and for a while he did. He reconciled with the church, reopened schools, restored the currency and created the Napoleonic Code, a system of law that still echoes in modern justice. He offered the people what they had sought since 1789, order after chaos, pride after shame. But beneath that order, the dream of the revolution faded. Liberty gave way to authority. Equality bowed before ambition. By 1804, the transformation was complete. In the great cathedral of Notre Dame, beneath glittering chandeliers and the eyes of a watching world, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. The symbolism was unmistakable. The Republic had promised to end the age of kings. Now a soldier from Corsica had placed a crown upon his own head, not by birthright, but by brilliance and will. France cheered him, for he had given them victory, glory, and empire. But the revolution, that fragile dream of liberty born in the heat of 1789, had finally laid down its arms. It had begun with hope, with speeches beneath the sun and the sound of bells over Paris. It ended beneath the shadow of a crown, in a ceremony of grandeur that seemed to erase every trace of the guillotine's horror. Yet even in that silence, something of the revolution remained. Not in the palaces, but in the people, in the way they thought of justice, of citizenship, of equality before the law. Those ideas could not be guillotined, could not be exiled, could not be conquered. The revolution's dream, though twisted, betrayed, and bloodstained, had reshaped the world forever. From the ashes of kings and the fever of terror, modern France was born. And across the seas, across generations, its fire would spark revolutions yet to come. So as night settles over Paris, over the bridges of the Seine, over the silent stones of the Bastille's ruins, the echo of that first cry still lingers in the air. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. The words that once began a storm now drift softly like prayer, like promise, like a memory that will never truly fade.